I never thought the worst day of my 74 years would start with a number, not a phone call, not a knock at the door, not even bad weather rolling off the River Dee the way it sometimes does in November, that gray kind of cold that gets into your coat before you've even buttoned it. No, it started with a number on a screen, or rather, the absence of one. I remember standing in the kitchen that morning, a Tuesday, I think, though after you retire, the days have a way of blurring into each other like watercolor left in the rain. And I was doing what I always do first thing. Kettle on, radio low, and then I'd sit at the small table by the window and open the banking app on my tablet. Not because I'm obsessed with money, mind you. I'm not. I spent 31 years as a railway systems inspector for Network Rail, and I've never been the sort of man who counted every penny twice. But when you're living alone on a fixed pension, you develop a rhythm. You check the balance the way you check the weather, just to know what kind of day it's going to be. The kettle had just started its low rumble when I tapped the screen and looked at the figure under current balance. I stared at it for a good 15 seconds before I put the tablet down. Then I picked it up again. Same number. Now, I want you to understand something. I'm not a man who panics easily. 31 years on the railways will do that to you. When you've stood on a platform at 2 in the morning, because a signal fault somewhere between Chester and Crewe has put 600 passengers at a standstill, and you've had to trace the exact fault back through 40 years of layered wiring infrastructure in the dark, well, you learn to keep your voice steady. You learn that panic doesn't solve anything. Information solves things. Calm solves things. So I didn't panic, but I did sit down. The number in that account was 214 years. My pension, the one I'd been receiving without a single interruption for nearly 9 years, was $1,847 per month. It should have arrived 4 days earlier, on the first Friday of the month, just as it always did, reliably, quietly, the way a well-maintained signal does its job without anyone needing to notice. It hadn't arrived. I thought, banking error. These things happen, don't they? Systems go down. Transfers get delayed. I'd read about it. I'd even seen it happen to a colleague of mine, Jeffrey, back in 2019. Whole direct debit disappeared for a week, and then came back with an apology letter and a small goodwill gesture. So I finished my tea, put on my good coat. The dark green one Margaret always said made me look distinguished, though I think she was just being kind. And I walked out into the Chester morning. I live in a flat on the south side of the city, not far from the Groves. You know the area, maybe, if you've ever been to Chester. That long stretch of riverside walkway with the iron railings and the willows that drag their fingers into the Dee when the water is high. It's not a grand apartment, nothing like that. It's modest. 2 bedrooms, though I only use the one now. A sitting room with a window that looks out over the water, and on clear evenings, especially in summer, you can watch the light go orange over the old city walls, and it's the kind of thing that makes you feel, in spite of everything, that the world is still fundamentally decent. I'd moved there after Margaret passed, 6 years ago now. The house in Hoole was too large for one person, too many rooms that had started to feel like accusations, so I sold it, quietly, and found the flat, and I told myself it was practical, and it was. But it was also, if I'm being honest, a way of starting again in a place where I didn't walk into the kitchen and expect to find her already up, already making toast, already humming something she'd heard on the radio the night before. Anyway. That Tuesday morning I walked up through the city, past the Groves, up toward the old walls, and then along into the center. Chester in November has its own particular mood. The tourists are mostly gone by then, and what's left is the city itself, the real one, the one the locals know. The old black and white buildings on the rows, catching the flat gray light, the smell of coffee from the cafes just opening, pigeons on the cobblestones, a man selling chestnuts from a cart near the cross. I've always loved the city at that hour. It feels like it belongs to itself again. The bank branch on Northgate Street has been there as long as I can remember. proper high street bank. None of this glass and steel business. I walked in just after 9:30 when the queue was short, and I asked to speak with someone about a possible error on my account. The young woman at the desk, and by young I mean she couldn't have been much past 30, if that, smiled very professionally and asked me to take a seat in one of the small side offices. A few minutes later, the branch manager came in. His name was Mr. Hartley. 50s, I'd guess. Careful eyes, the kind that are trained to stay neutral. He shook my hand and sat down across from me and asked how he could help. I explained the situation. Missing pension payment. Probably a transfer delay, I said. Just wanted to check everything was in order. He typed something into his computer. Then he stopped typing. He looked at the screen for a moment that lasted slightly longer than it should have. Then he looked at me. "Mr. Ashcroft," he said, "could I ask you to bear with me for just one moment while I pull up the full account history?" I said of course. He typed some more. I could see his face, but not the screen, and I watched something happen in his expression. Nothing dramatic, nothing you could put a name to immediately. Just a very slight shift, like a man who has found something in a drawer he wasn't expecting and isn't yet sure what to do about it. "Mr. Ashcroft," he said again, and this time his voice had dropped just a fraction. "I want to make sure I'm reading this correctly before I tell you anything." "Take your time," I said. He took his time, and then he turned the screen toward me. Not the whole screen, just a printout he'd quietly prepared while I was looking the other way. It was a transaction history, 7 months of it, and every month, on the first Friday, a payment had arrived. My pension. Regular as clockwork, and every month, within 48 hours of its arrival, the entire amount had been transferred out. Not to a utility company, not to a mortgage provider, not to any of the usual places money goes when you're simply living your life. To a single account, the same account, every time. I looked at the reference numbers for a while. I didn't say anything. "Mr. Ashcroft," Mr. Hartley said, very carefully, "these transfers were authorized. There's a signed mandate on file. The documentation was submitted through our standard third-party authorization process, just under 8 months ago." I looked up from the page. "What does the signature look like?" I asked. He hesitated. Then he slid another piece of paper across the desk, a photocopy of a form. And at the bottom, in what was, I will tell you honestly, a very convincing approximation of my own handwriting, was my name, Thomas William Ashcroft. I looked at that signature for a long time. I looked at the loops on the capital letters, the particular way the T and the W ran together, which has always been a habit of mine going back to when my father taught me cursive writing on Saturday mornings with a fountain pen he'd kept since his own school days. Someone had studied my handwriting, studied it carefully. "I didn't sign this," I said. Not loudly, not with any performance attached to it. I just said it the way you'd state a fact. Mr. Hartley nodded, very slowly. "I think," he said, "that you'll want to take copies of everything I've shown you today, and I think you'll want to get some legal advice." He was right on both counts. I left that bank 40 minutes later with a manila folder under my arm, containing 17 photocopied pages. The morning felt different outside. The chestnuts still smelled the same. The pigeons were still at the cross, but the city felt slightly further away, as if a pane of glass had been slipped between me and everything I was looking at. I'm a man who has spent his life reading technical documents, fault logs, signal reports, infrastructure assessments. I know how to take information and hold it steadily in your mind, without letting it knock you sideways before you've had time to understand it properly. So I didn't fall apart on Northgate Street. I just walked. I went along Bridge Street and down toward the river, and I stood at the railings for a while and watched the Dee moving under the old bridge, the way it has been moving since long before any of us were born. 7 months. 12,929 pounds. That's what the folder told me. Nearly 13,000 pounds, taken in increments small enough that, if you weren't looking closely, if you were just an old man who trusted that everything was running as it should, you might not notice until it was almost gone. I'm not going to pretend I didn't feel it. I'm 74 years old. I've worked hard my entire life. I watched every colleague I had retire on modest but careful savings, and I did the same. That money wasn't a fortune, but it was mine. It represented 9 years of quiet, decent, independent life after 31 years on the railways. And someone had reached into that life and taken from it systematically, month after month. But here's the thing that stayed with me more than the number. What stayed with me was the signature, not the money. The signature. Because someone who wanted to take 13,000 pounds from a stranger could have done it 100 different ways. Fraud, hacking, impersonation from a distance. But this was done using a document that required careful observation. Someone who had seen me sign things before. Someone who knew the particular way I hold a pen. The way the letters lean very slightly to the right. The way my W has always had 3 peaks, where most people only make 2. Someone close. I stood there at the river for a long time. I didn't have an answer yet. But the question was already there, fully formed, standing quietly at the edge of everything. I walked home along the groves, made myself a proper lunch. Nothing special, just soup and bread. The kind of thing Margaret used to say was the best meal in the world on a cold day. And she wasn't wrong. I sat at the window and watched a narrow boat moving slowly up the Dee, and I thought about the folder on the table, and I thought about everything it might mean. Now, I should tell you a little about my family, because none of what I'm about to describe will make proper sense without it. My son Oliver is 48. He lives on the other side of Chester, in Boughton. Nice area, sensible house, the kind of place you picture when someone says, respectable family life. Oliver works as an accountant, has done since he was 25. He's a steady man, Oliver. Measured, careful with numbers, careful with words, very much like me in some ways, which means we sometimes go weeks without saying anything beyond the practical. Not because we don't care. Just because we're both men who trust silence as much as conversation. His wife, Vanessa, is 44. She ran, at the time I'm talking about, a small financial consultancy from an office near the station. Smart woman. Very sharp. The kind of person who could walk into any room and within 5 minutes understand exactly who in it was worth speaking to. I'd always respected that about her. She had a quality I associated with people who'd had to work harder than others to be taken seriously, and who'd learned to use their intelligence like a precise instrument as a result. We'd always got on well enough, Vanessa and I. Not intimately. There was always a certain formality between us, the kind you sometimes find between a parent and a son's spouse when neither party is quite certain how much emotional territory to claim. But we were comfortable. She called me Thomas. I called her Vanessa. She laughed easily at dinner and always made sure I had something good to drink. When Margaret died, she was the one who organized the flowers. That sort of person. Oliver had suggested, about 3 months before all this, that we make a habit of Sunday dinner. Just the 3 of us. He'd said it casually, the way Oliver says most things, as if the idea had occurred to him in the middle of some other thought. But I'd appreciated it. It gave the weeks a shape. The Sunday after my visit to the bank, I went for dinner as usual. Vanessa had made a roast. Proper one. Pork, crackling, roasted potatoes, the whole business. The kind of meal that takes most of the afternoon and fills the whole house with a smell that makes you feel, for a moment, like everything is entirely fine. Oliver poured wine. We talked about nothing in particular for a while. A planning dispute in Boughton, something Oliver had read about the railways. He always clips things out that he thinks I'll find interesting, which is one of those small kindnesses I've never told him I notice, but always do. After the main course, when Vanessa was clearing the plates and Oliver was topping up the glasses, I let the conversation find a natural pause. And then, very calmly, I said, Vanessa, I was wondering, have you ever dealt with any paperwork to do with my pension? Anything administrative, I mean. Signatures, account details, that sort of thing. I watched her. I watched her the way you watch a signal on the railway, not with suspicion, necessarily, but with attention, because signals tell you things, and what they don't say is often as important as what they do. She didn't stop moving. That was the first thing. She continued stacking the plates with exactly the same efficiency she'd been using before I spoke. She glanced up at me, just briefly, just once, with an expression that was perfectly assembled, and then she smiled. "You worry far too much about money, Thomas," she said. And then she carried the plates into the kitchen. Oliver looked at me across the table with an expression I couldn't read. He started to say something, then seemed to decide against it. He picked up his glass instead. That was the end of the conversation. But something happened in me at that moment. Something that didn't announce itself with any drama or noise. It was quieter than that. It was the feeling you get when you're standing in a signal box at 3 in the morning and you've been looking at the same fault pattern for 40 minutes. And then, suddenly, without any single piece of new information arriving, you understand exactly what the fault is. Not because something changed, because everything you'd already been looking at, when you finally arranged it correctly, pointed to one answer. I drove home that evening and sat in my chair by the window. The River Dee was dark by then, just a suggestion of movement in the lamplight from the groves. I opened the manila folder on my lap, and I looked at the account number to which every one of my pension payments had been redirected for 7 consecutive months. I looked at it for a long time. Then I picked up my phone and sent a text message to Richard Beaumont. Richard is 71. He's been a solicitor in Chester for over 40 years. One of those men who seems to have always existed, who you can't quite imagine as young, who carries the weight of other people's difficult situations with a steadiness that I've always found deeply reassuring. He was a friend of mine long before he was ever my solicitor. We'd met through the Railway Heritage Society years ago. Richard has a particular fondness for Victorian infrastructure, which I've always respected in a man. My text said, "Richard, I need to talk to you. Not urgently, but soon. Something's come up that I think you should know about." He replied within the hour, "I'm free Thursday morning, Thomas. Come to the office. I'll have the kettle on." I looked at that message for a moment. Then I put the folder away in the drawer beneath the kitchen counter, where I keep documents I need to remember, but don't want to look at every day. I went to bed at my usual time. I lay in the dark and listened to the river and thought about Vanessa saying, "You worry far too much about money," Thomas with that precise, assembled smile. And I thought about the signature at the bottom of that authorization form. And I thought about what it means to trust someone. What it really means. Not the feeling of it. The word is easy. The feeling is easy. But the actual structural reality of trust, the way it gets built over years through 1,000 small, ordinary things, and the particular, very specific thing that happens inside a man when he understands, not suspects, not fears, but understands that something fundamental has been broken without him ever being given the chance to know it was at risk. I'm not a man who cries easily, but I'll tell you something. That night, I came close, not because of the money, not even entirely because of the signature, but because I sat there in the dark and I realized something I hadn't expected to realize. I realized that the most painful part of all of this wasn't what had been taken from me. It was what that taking had revealed. That somewhere in this family, in the quiet, careful life I'd been living beside these people, sharing Sunday dinners and polite conversation and a certain fond, managed distance, somewhere in there, someone had looked at me and decided that what I represented, more than anything else, was a resource, and they had never, not once, not for a single moment, considered simply telling me the truth. Thursday felt a long way away. Richard's office is on St. Werburgh Street, tucked between a bookshop and a solicitor's firm that's been there even longer than his. It's the kind of building that Chester does particularly well. Old stone, narrow windows, a front door with brass fittings that have been polished so many times over the decades that the edges have gone soft. I've always liked walking into that building. It smells of old paper and wood polish, and something else I can never quite name. History, maybe, or just the particular atmosphere that accumulates in places where serious things have been said quietly for a very long time. I arrived at 9:30 on Thursday morning. Richard's secretary, a composed woman named Patricia, who has worked for him for going on 22 years, and who I suspect knows more about the legal affairs of Chester than most of the city's judges, showed me through to his office without any fuss. Richard was already standing when I came in. He's a tall man, Richard. Slightly stooped now, the way tall men often go after 70, as if the body has spent a lifetime trying to make itself more convenient for doorways. White hair, carefully kept. Glasses on a cord around his neck that he invariably puts on the wrong way round the first time. He shook my hand with both of his, the way he always does when he knows something is actually wrong. "Sit down, Thomas," he said. "Tea's coming." We talked about nothing for a few minutes while Patricia brought the tray. The Heritage Railway Society had a meeting coming up. Richard had been reading something about the original Chester to Holyhead line, and wanted my opinion on a particular engineering decision from 1848 that he claimed had always struck him as unnecessarily bold. Under any other circumstances, I would have enjoyed the conversation enormously. That morning, I let it run its course, and then I placed the manila folder on the desk between us. 7 months, I said. Nearly £13,000, and a signature that isn't mine. Richard didn't touch the folder immediately. He looked at me first. "Tell me everything," he said, "from the beginning, in your own time." So I did. I told him about the Tuesday morning and the kitchen and the number on the screen. I told him about Northgate Street and Mr. Hartley's careful face. I told him about the photocopied authorization form and the signature that looked like mine but wasn't. I told him about the Sunday dinner and the question I'd asked, and the way Vanessa had continued stacking plates without breaking her rhythm. I told him what she'd said. I told him about coming home and sitting in the dark and looking at the account number. Richard listened to all of it without interrupting once. That's one of the things I've always valued most about him. He listens the way good engineers read a schematic, completely, without jumping ahead, without deciding what he thinks until he's seen the whole picture. When I finished, he opened the folder. He went through every page slowly. The transaction records, the authorization form, the account details, the timeline. He put his glasses on, the right way round, which meant he was concentrating. And he moved through the documents with the quiet efficiency of a man who has spent 4 decades making sense of other people's complicated situations. After about 10 minutes, he closed the folder and took his glasses off. "Thomas," he said, "I want to ask you something, and I'd like you to think about your answer, rather than just giving me the first one that comes." "All right," I said. "Before I start any formal process, before I begin tracing this account, requesting documentation, or contacting anyone, what is it you actually want to happen here?" I looked at him. It was, I realized, the right question. And it was also, I realized, a question I hadn't yet properly answered for myself. I'd spent 2 days holding the facts of the situation. I hadn't yet been honest with myself about what I wanted to do with them. "I want the truth," I said finally. "All of it. Whatever it is. I want to understand exactly what happened and why. And then I want to make a decision based on that understanding, rather than based on what I'm feeling right now." Richard nodded slowly. "That," he said, "is the most sensible thing anyone has said to me in this office this entire month." He picked up a pen and pulled a fresh notepad toward him. "Then let's start from the beginning." We spent 2 hours in that office. By the time I left, Richard had a list of 16 separate items he intended to pursue: account tracing, authorization verification, handwriting comparison if it became necessary, and a quiet review of the financial record of anyone who might plausibly have had access both to my personal documents and to my banking details. He was methodical about it in the way that only people who have genuinely loved their work for decades can be. Not mechanical. Methodical. There's a difference. Mechanical is doing a thing correctly. Methodical is doing a thing correctly because you understand precisely why it matters. He walked me to the door himself, which he doesn't always do. "Thomas," he said on the step, "I want you to do one thing for me while I'm working on this." "What's that?" I said. "Don't change anything. Don't alter your routine. Don't avoid Oliver and Vanessa. Don't ask more questions. Just live your ordinary life and let me do the work." I told him I could manage that. Walking back through Chester that morning, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not relief, exactly, but something in the same family as it. The particular steadiness that comes when you've placed something heavy and awkward into the hands of someone who knows how to carry it properly, and you can straighten up again and simply walk. I went along Eastgate Street, past the old clock, Chester's Eastgate clock, which has looked out over the city since 1899, and which I never pass without feeling a small, quiet satisfaction at the solidity of things that are built to last. Down through the rows, those extraordinary medieval galleries that run along the first floor of the old city center buildings, so that you walk at street level on one side and at gallery level on the other, the whole thing layered and particular in a way that no other city in England quite replicates. I stopped at a small cafe on Bridge Street that I've been going to for years, not because it's fashionable or remarkable, but because the coffee is exactly right, and the tables are far enough apart that you can sit and think without feeling observed. I sat there for an hour with a pot of coffee and the morning paper I mostly didn't read. I thought about Oliver. This is the part that kept returning to me, and I want to be honest about it, because I think it's important. Oliver is my son. He's 48 years old, and he's worked hard his entire adult life, and he's built something decent and steady for himself. And as I sat in that cafe on Bridge Street with the old buildings of Chester, visible through the window and the quiet morning sounds of the city going about its business, I kept asking myself the same question. Does he know? Does Oliver know what Vanessa has done? Because if he does, then the situation is one thing, and if he doesn't, then it's something else entirely. And the two versions of that truth point in completely different directions, both emotionally and practically. And I needed to understand which one I was actually living inside before I could make any decisions about anything. I didn't have an answer. Not yet. But the question stayed with me like a stone in a shoe for the rest of that week. Now, I want to tell you something about what the following days were like, because I think people sometimes imagine that this kind of situation, finding out that money has been taken, that a signature has been forged, that something fundamental has been happening behind your back for months, they imagine it must be constantly dramatic, constantly loud inside your head, like a siren that doesn't stop. It wasn't like that, at least not for me. What it was like was this: ordinary life, but with a slightly different quality to it, like listening to a piece of music you know well, but played in a different key, everything recognizable, everything slightly, persistently wrong. I went for my usual morning walks, down along the groves, along the river, sometimes up through Grosvenor Park when the weather allowed. Grosvenor Park in November is a particular thing. The big cedar trees hold their shape when everything else has given up its leaves. The bandstand stands there in the gray light, looking patient. The park has that specific autumn emptiness that isn't sad, exactly. It's more like the city breathing out. I've always found it good for thinking, that park. Margaret and I used to walk there on Sunday mornings when Oliver was young, and then later, after he'd grown and the Sunday mornings were our own again. We kept the habit because we discovered we actually liked it, not because of any nostalgia, just because the park was genuinely good. I thought about Margaret quite a bit that week. Not in a painful way, or not only in a painful way, more in the way you think about someone whose judgment you trusted absolutely, and whom you missed not only for themselves, but for the particular clarity they always brought to difficult things. Margaret had a quality I've never been able to fully describe. She could look at a complicated situation and identify, within minutes, what the actual question was, not the surface question, the real one underneath, the one that everything else was really about. I know what she would have said about this. She would have said, "Thomas, the money is not the point. Figure out what the point is." And she would have been right. She almost always was. And here's what I want to say to you. If you're watching this, if you're sitting wherever you are right now, maybe with your own version of a complicated family situation, or a difficult question you haven't yet managed to answer, I want you to think about that. Because I've discovered in 74 years of living that almost every serious problem in a person's life has a surface question and a real question underneath it. And the surface question is usually about things: money, property, rights, practicalities. But the real question is almost always about people, about what they believed, about what they were afraid of, about what they couldn't bring themselves to say. This story, I can tell you now, is about the real question underneath. But I'm getting ahead of myself. If you're finding this story worthwhile, if something in it is speaking to something in your own life, then I'd ask you to do one thing right now. Subscribe to this channel. Hit that button and the bell beside it if you're willing, because there are more stories coming. Stories like this one, true ones or true enough to matter, and I'd hate for you to miss what happens next, because what happens next surprised even me. Richard called on the following Tuesday, just over a week after our meeting at St. Werburgh Street. He said he had some initial findings and that I should come in at my convenience. His voice was even, measured, the way it always is. But I know Richard well enough to hear the texture beneath the surface of a sentence, and the texture that Tuesday told me he'd found something significant. I went in the next morning. Patricia showed me through as before. Tea arrived as before. But this time Richard was already seated when I came in, and the folder on his desk was considerably thicker than the one I'd left with him. "Thomas," he said, "I want to start by telling you something, and I'd like you to listen to the whole of it before you respond." "Go on," I said. "The account into which your pension has been redirected is a business account," he said. "Registered to a limited company here in Chester. The company was established 4 years ago and operates in the financial services sector. It is currently, and has been for approximately the last 18 months, in a very difficult financial position." He paused. "The account is in the name of Vanessa Collins Ashcroft," he said. I didn't say anything. "Now," Richard continued, "I want to be careful here, because what I'm about to tell you changes the shape of this considerably, and I think it matters that you understand it in the right order." He opened the folder. The money that was transferred into that account over the past 7 months, all 12,929 pounds of it, did not go on anything personal. There's no evidence of holidays, luxury purchases, or any kind of extravagant personal expenditure. What it went on was operational costs, staff wages, software subscriptions, a lease payment that was 3 months overdue, a tax bill from the previous financial year. He looked at me over the tops of his glasses. "Vanessa's consultancy has been struggling badly for at least 2 years. She's lost 3 major clients in that period. From what I can gather, a combination of a difficult market and, frankly, some business decisions that didn't work out the way she'd hoped. She's been trying to keep it alive, and it seems that at some point, when she ran out of other options, she found a way to redirect your pension." I sat with that for a moment. The window of Richard's office looks out onto St. Werburgh Street, and there was a delivery lorry parked outside, and the driver was trying to maneuver around a cyclist's rack. And I watched that for a few seconds while I arranged the new information alongside everything I'd already known. Does Oliver know? I asked. Richard's expression told me the answer before he said it. I don't believe so, he said. Nothing in what I've been able to examine suggests that Oliver has any knowledge of this. In fact, and this is a matter of inference rather than documentation, so I want to be careful. It seems quite possible that concealing this situation from Oliver was as much a motivation as anything else. I thought about that. I thought about Vanessa at the dinner table, talking with Oliver about the planning dispute in Boughton, laughing at something on the radio, making roast pork with crackling and serving it with the particular confident ease of someone who has decided, for the time being, that the world they're presenting is the one that is real, and underneath that, the quiet, accumulating pressure of a business dying slowly and a debt growing larger every month. She thought she'd pay it back, I said. It wasn't really a question. Almost certainly, Richard said. That's the pattern. It always starts as borrowing, in the person's own mind. It only becomes something else when the ability to repay doesn't materialize. I nodded. We sat quietly for a moment. The delivery lorry had finally got clear of the bicycle rack and moved on, and the street outside was ordinary again. Richard, I said, what are my options? He picked up his pen. Well, he said, that depends entirely on what you want, Thomas, which is the same question I asked you last week. And this time, the answer came more slowly, because this time I had the full picture, and the full picture was not what I'd expected it to be. I'd walked into that first meeting half prepared for something calculating, something cold, someone who had simply seen an old man's money and decided it was available. That version of events would have been, in its own terrible way, easier to process. It would have had clean edges, a clear shape. But this was different. This was someone who had been drowning and unable to ask for help, and eventually reaching for anything that might keep them afloat for one more month. Just one more month. Always one more month. With the absolute genuine intention of making it right before anyone noticed. And that, I found, sitting in Richard Beaumont's office on a gray November morning in Chester, with tea going cold beside me, and nearly 13,000 pounds gone from my account. That was a profoundly more difficult thing to hold. I looked at the folder. I looked at Richard. Give me a few days, I said. He nodded immediately. Of course. I need to think about what I actually believe, I said. About people, about what they deserve when they've done something wrong, but not something simple. Richard looked at me for a moment with an expression I can only describe as something close to respect. Take as long as you need, he said. I'm not going anywhere. I put my coat on and walked out onto St. Werburgh Street into the gray Chester morning. I stood there for a moment, the folder under my arm, the old city going about its business all around me. A woman unlocking the bookshop next door, the smell of bread from somewhere, the sound of the cathedral clock beginning its slow count of the hour. 11 o'clock. I started walking. I didn't go home. Not yet. I walked down through the city, past the rows, past the old market hall, and down to the river. I stood at the groves and looked at the Dee for a long time. The water doesn't hurry the Dee. It moves with a kind of ancient patience, as if it's been doing this long enough to know that there's no particular advantage in rushing. I've always found that comforting, in a way that I couldn't easily explain to anyone who hasn't spent time beside it. I stood there and I thought about Margaret, and about Oliver, and about Vanessa. And somewhere in that thinking, a question formed itself with a clarity I hadn't expected. Not what should be done to her, but something else entirely. Something that, when it arrived, felt less like a new thought, and more like the only thought that had ever really been there, waiting for me to be still enough to hear it. I'd need to find the right moment to ask it. And that moment, I suspected, was coming sooner than any of us were prepared for. The days that followed Richard's second meeting were the quietest of the whole situation, and I want to be clear about what I mean by quiet, because I don't mean peaceful. I mean the particular kind of quiet that settles over a man when he's carrying something heavy and hasn't yet decided where to put it down. I kept to my routines. That was deliberate. I've always believed that routines are undervalued, not as a way of avoiding life, but as a way of creating the conditions in which you can actually think properly. When the surface of your day is predictable, the deeper water has room to move. So I kept the morning walks. I kept the evening reading. I kept the radio on at breakfast and the window open an inch in the sitting room, the way I've done since Margaret died, because the sound of the river at night is one of those things that makes a room feel less empty without pretending it isn't. I went back to Grosvenor Park twice that week, once in the morning, when the light was flat and the park was mostly empty, just the odd dog walker moving purposefully along the paths, and the cedar trees standing the way they always do, with that particular patience that very old trees seem to develop, and once in the late afternoon, when the light had gone amber and the shadows were long, and the whole park had that quality of a held breath between the end of the working day and the beginning of the evening. On both occasions, I sat on the bench near the bandstand that Margaret and I had claimed as ours over many years of Sunday morning walking. Not officially, of course, just the way couples develop these quiet territorial habits, the particular corner table in a restaurant, the particular pew in a church, the particular bench in a park. And I sat there and I thought about Oliver. I keep coming back to Oliver, and I think I need to explain why, because it might not be immediately obvious. When you discover that someone has wronged you, the natural instinct, at least for most people, at least in my experience, is to think about the wrong and about the person who did it. Vanessa, the forged signature, the redirected payments, the 17 photocopied pages in the manila folder. But I kept thinking about Oliver, because Oliver, as far as Richard could determine, knew nothing. Oliver had been living in that house in Boughton, going to work every morning, coming home every evening, sitting down to dinner, watching the news, having the ordinary texture of a decent and careful life. And all the while, 6 inches beneath the surface of it, something had been building. A debt that was also a secret that was also a kind of wall, a wall that meant Oliver had been living, for at least 18 months, in a version of his own marriage that wasn't the complete one, and nobody had told him, not Vanessa, which I could understand, in a painful sort of way. Shame does that to people. It doesn't excuse it, but it explains it. When you've made a series of decisions that were wrong, and each one made the next one slightly easier to rationalize, and the gap between who you actually are and who you're presenting yourself as has grown so wide that the idea of admitting it feels like jumping off something very high. When you're in that place, telling the truth becomes something you keep meaning to do tomorrow, and then the day after tomorrow, and then next week, when things are slightly better, when you can soften the blow with the repayment you're just about to make. I know this pattern, not from my own life, but from watching people during my railway career. I've seen it in colleagues who made professional errors, good engineers, careful people, who made one mistake and then covered it with another and then another until the original mistake was buried under a structure of secondary decisions that had become their own problem. The covering up always does more damage than the original error, but the covering up feels survivable in the moment, in a way that the truth doesn't. Vanessa had been doing that, month after month, telling herself she'd replace it before anyone noticed, before it mattered, before it became the thing that it had, by then, already become. But Oliver was the part that genuinely kept me awake, because my son is 48 years old. He's worked his entire adult life building something honest and careful, and the person he had chosen to build it with, the person he came home to, and shared decisions with, and trusted with the ordinary vulnerable details of a life. That person had been keeping something from him that he had an absolute right to know, and had been keeping it, I suspected, not just out of shame, but out of fear. Fear of what Oliver would think, fear of what he'd say, fear, perhaps, of what it would do to the particular careful structure of the life they'd built, which told me something about their marriage that was, in its own way, as troubling as anything in the financial records. When you're afraid to tell the person you've chosen the truth about a serious mistake, it means the relationship has, somewhere along the way, stopped feeling like a place where truth can safely land. And that doesn't happen suddenly. It happens in increments, the way almost everything important in life happens. Small moments of avoidance, small conversations that don't quite reach the thing they were circling, small reassurances that substitute for real understanding, accumulated over years until the distance between two people in the same house is significant, and neither of them has been able to name the moment it started. I'm not blaming Oliver for that. I want to be clear about that. He couldn't have known what he didn't know. But sitting on that bench in Grosvenor Park in the amber light of a November afternoon, I found myself thinking that even when this was resolved, even when the financial part of it had been properly addressed, there was a different, longer, quieter piece of work ahead for both of them, if they chose to do it. That particular afternoon, a man I recognized came along the park path, a retired colleague of mine from Network Rail, a signals engineer called Bernard Thwaite, who'd finished around the same time as me, and now spent most of his days either in the park or in the city library doing what he called finishing his education. Bernard is 76, thin as a filing cabinet, with a magnificent gray mustache that he maintains with a seriousness I've always admired. He spotted me and came over without any ceremony. "Thomas," he said, sitting down beside me without being invited, which is something Bernard has always done, and which I've always found rather refreshing. "You look like a man who's been arguing with himself and losing." "Something like that," I said. "Anything worth discussing?" I considered that for a moment. I didn't tell him the details. That wasn't appropriate. And besides, I'm not a man who unburdens himself to others readily. But I said something that had been forming itself in my thinking for several days, and that I hadn't yet said aloud to anyone. "Bernard," I said, "have you ever had to decide between what you're entitled to do and what's actually right?" He looked at the bandstand for a moment. "Every interesting decision in my life has been exactly that," he said. "The uninteresting ones are where those two things happen to coincide." We sat with that for a while. "The entitlement," I said, "is usually the easier one to justify." "Always," he said. "That's rather the point of entitlement. It comes with its justification already attached. The right thing makes you do the work yourself." He stood up after a few more minutes and said he had books to return, and walked off along the path with the slightly uneven gait he's had since a hip replacement 2 years ago. I watched him go and sat for a while longer. Then I went home and called Richard. "I've made a decision," I said. "Not the final one, not yet, but a directional one." "Tell me," he said. "I don't want this to become legal unless it has to," I said. "I don't want police involvement unless I have no other reasonable choice. What I want is the full picture, every document, every transfer, every piece of paper. And then I want a private conversation, with both of them." A pause. "All right," Richard said. "How long do I need?" "How long do you need?" I asked. "Another 10 days, he said. "Maybe 2 weeks. I want everything in order before you sit them down, every number accounted for, every transfer documented, nothing that can be disputed or reframed. If you're going to have that conversation, I want you to have it from a position of complete information." "Then take the 2 weeks," I said. "And Thomas," he said, "I want to be there, not to intervene, not to make it formal, but as a witness and as your solicitor. Will you allow that?" I told him I would. What followed, those 2 weeks of waiting, were, in a strange way, among the more instructive of my recent life, because there is something clarifying about having made a decision, and then simply having to wait for the right moment to act on it. The urgency lifts. The static quiets. And in that space, you find yourself thinking not about what's going to happen, but about what things mean. I thought about money, for instance, about what it actually represents and how much of our relationship with it is practical, and how much is something else entirely. I'd worked 31 years for Network Rail. I'd been careful, not miserly. I'd never been miserly. Margaret wouldn't have stood for it. And anyway, it's a quality I find genuinely unattractive in people, but careful, deliberate. I'd never spent money I didn't have, never borrowed to live beyond my means, never convinced myself that tomorrow's earnings could responsibly fund today's choices. That's partly temperament and partly background. I grew up in a household where money was discussed honestly and handled carefully, not because we were struggling, we weren't particularly, but because my father believed that carelessness with money was a symptom of carelessness with reality. Money, he used to say, doesn't tell you who you are, but how you treat it tells you quite a lot. I've thought about that often over the years, and sitting in my flat above the D with the November rain on the window and the river moving steadily beneath it, I thought about it again, about what it means when the people around you develop a relationship with money and with the truth that is built on avoidance rather than honesty, about whether that's a moral failure or a human one, and about whether there is, in the end, a meaningful difference between the two. I also thought about forgiveness, not in the easy sense, not the kind of forgiveness that people talk about as if it's a decision you make once and then the work is done. Real forgiveness, the kind that actually changes something, is far more demanding than that. It requires you to see the person who wronged you clearly, not charitably, not generously, clearly, to understand what they did and why they did it, and what it cost, and to hold all of that without either minimizing it or magnifying it beyond what it actually was. And then, from that clear-eyed place, to choose how you're going to move forward. I wasn't there yet. I want to be honest about that. I wasn't in a place of forgiveness during those 2 weeks. I was in a place of understanding, which is, I think, the necessary step before forgiveness becomes genuinely possible. You can't forgive what you haven't understood. You can only pretend to, and pretending helps no one. Now, and I want to say this directly to you, because I think it's one of the most important things in this whole story. If you've ever been in a position where someone you trusted did something that broke that trust, then you'll know what I mean. When I say that the work of understanding is slow and it's uncomfortable, and there are days when you'd genuinely rather be angry, because anger is at least clean. It has a shape. It moves in a direction. Understanding doesn't do any of those things. It just sits there and insists on being complicated. But here's what I've come to believe in 74 years. The uncomfortable, complicated, slow work of understanding is the only thing that ever actually leads somewhere worth going. Anger gets you moving. Understanding gets you somewhere worth arriving. If that means something to you, if something in this story is sitting with you in a way that feels useful, then please, stay with us. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. There are more stories coming, and each one is built around the same simple idea, that the most important things in a human life are almost never the dramatic ones. They're the quiet ones, the ones that happen in apartments above rivers and on park benches, and in solicitors' offices on gray November mornings. The ones that don't make the news, but that change you permanently. This one changed me. I'm going to tell you how. Richard called on a Thursday morning, exactly 14 days after I'd told him to take the 2 weeks he needed. "I'm ready," he said. "Everything's there?" I said. "Everything," he said. "Documented, ordered, accounted for. Every transfer, every date, every corresponding business payment that the money was used for on the other end. It's complete, Thomas." I sat down at my kitchen table. "And the signature?" I said. "A handwriting analyst friend of mine, retired, completely discreet, has confirmed in writing that the signature on the authorization form is not yours. The letter formation, the pen pressure, the specific characteristics of your capital letters, they're close, very close. Whoever did this studied your handwriting carefully, but they're not your signature." I looked out at the river. "All right," I said. "Let's do it this week." I waited until the following Sunday. I chose Sunday deliberately. Not the dinner. I didn't want it to happen at Oliver's house, on Vanessa's ground, with the practical business of cooking and clearing and the ordinary machinery of a family meal as a backdrop. I called Oliver on Friday and told him I'd like them both to come to my flat on Sunday afternoon. I said I had some things I wanted to discuss, and that it was important, and that I hoped they could make the time. Oliver, to his credit, didn't ask questions. He just said of course, and what time, and would I like him to bring anything. "Just come," I said. "That's all." I spent Saturday cleaning the flat properly. Not that it needed it badly, but there's something about cleaning before a significant moment that feels right to me. It's a way of preparing the space, of saying, in some wordless way, that what's about to happen deserves a clean room to happen in. I polished the window in the sitting room until the view of the river was perfectly clear. I laid the kitchen table with 4 chairs, one for me, one for Oliver, one for Vanessa, one for Richard, who would arrive separately after them. I put the folder in the center of the table, closed. Sunday afternoon arrived gray and still, the way November afternoons in Chester often do. Not dramatically bad weather, just the city wrapped in its own quiet. I stood at the window for a while before they were due, looking at the Dee. The narrow boats were moored for the winter, and the river moved without them, and the willows on the far bank were bare now, and the whole scene had that stripped-back quality that November gives to things. I thought about Margaret. Not with sadness, particularly, with something more like conversation, the kind you have in your head with people who aren't there anymore, the kind that is really just thinking, but feels like something more than that. I told her what I was about to do. I told her I wasn't sure it was right, but that I was sure it was the only thing I could live with. And I felt, this is going to sound sentimental, and I'm too old to care about that. I felt something that I can only describe as agreement. The doorbell rang at 2 o'clock exactly. Oliver came in first, coat still on, that slightly careful expression he gets when he knows something important is happening and is choosing his words in advance. Vanessa behind him, composed in the way she always was, cashmere jumper, hair neat, a smile that I could now read with a precision I'd lacked 2 months ago. They came into the sitting room and I took their coats and I made tea. Proper tea, in the good pot, with the cups that Margaret had bought at a market in Shrewsbury about 20 years ago, and that I've always used for occasions that feel like they require the best of what the cupboard has to offer. We sat down, and I didn't say anything for a while. The tea steamed. The river moved outside the window. The city went about its Sunday. Oliver looked at me once, then at the table, then at me again. Vanessa looked at the middle distance and held her cup in both hands, with a stillness that was, I knew now, the stillness of someone managing something very carefully. I thought of all the things I could say, all the ways I could open it. And then the downstairs buzzer sounded, and I stood and pressed the intercom and said, "Come up." And a minute later, Richard Beaumont appeared in the doorway in his good coat with his briefcase, and the expressions on their faces. Oliver's puzzled, Vanessa's changed, just fractionally, in a way I can't quite describe to you except to say that something rearranged itself behind her eyes in the space of a single second, told me that whatever was about to happen, we had arrived at it. I let Richard settle. I poured him tea. I sat back down. And then I looked at Vanessa, not with anger, not with accusation, just with the clear, steady attention of a man who has spent 2 months arriving at a question and has finally found the right moment to ask it. The folder remained closed on the table. For now, nobody spoke for a long time. That's the thing I remember most clearly about those first minutes in the sitting room. Not what was said, what wasn't. The 4 of us sitting around that kitchen table with the tea going warm in the cups, and the folder closed in the center, and the River Dee moving steadily outside the window, and the particular quality of silence that settles over a room when everyone in it knows that something significant is about to happen, and nobody is quite ready to be the one who begins it." Oliver looked at Richard, then at me, then at the folder. His face had the expression of a man running calculations he doesn't yet have enough information to complete. Oliver is an accountant. He reads situations the way he reads figures, methodically, carefully, looking for the pattern before he commits to an interpretation. I watched him looking at the closed folder, and I could see him understanding, in a general way, that whatever was inside it was the reason we were all here. He just didn't know the specifics yet. Vanessa had gone very still. Not the composed stillness of the woman who had stacked plates at the dinner table and told me I worried too much about money. This was a different kind of stillness, the kind that comes when the body understands something the mind is still trying to negotiate with. She was holding her teacup in both hands the way she had been since she sat down, but I noticed that she had not taken a single sip. She was looking at the table, not at me, not at Richard, at the table, at the folder. Richard sat quietly with his briefcase beside his chair, his hands folded on the table in front of him. I've always admired his ability to occupy a room without imposing on it. 40 years of legal practice teaches you, I suppose, when to take up space and when to leave it for the situation to fill. I was the one who spoke first, and I want to tell you what I said, because it's the part of this whole story that I've thought about most in the time since, the part that cost me the most to get right. I didn't reach for the folder. I looked at Vanessa and I said, quietly and without any particular drama attached to it, "Why didn't you trust me enough to tell me you were drowning?" The room changed when I said it. Not dramatically. There was no noise, no sudden movement. But something shifted in the atmosphere, the way the air changes in a room when a window is opened. Oliver's expression moved from careful calculation to something rawer and more confused. And Vanessa, who had been so composed, who had maintained that particular careful surface through weeks of Sunday dinners and ordinary family life while all of this was building underneath, Vanessa's face simply fell apart. Not loudly. She didn't cry out or put her hands over her face or do any of the things you might picture. Her face just fell, in the way that a structure falls when the thing that has been holding it together is no longer there. Quietly, completely, with a kind of terrible dignity. She put the teacup down very carefully on the table, and then she looked at me. And what I saw in her face in that moment was not what I'd expected to see. I'd been prepared, in some part of myself, for deflection, for the instinct to defend, to reframe, to find the angle from which the story could be told differently. I'd seen it before in my working life, the colleague caught in a professional error who spends the first 10 minutes finding reasons why the error was, in some technical sense, not entirely their fault. But there was none of that. What I saw in Vanessa's face was something I can only describe as the specific exhaustion of someone who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time, and has finally, in this moment, been given permission to put it down. "I don't know," she said. Her voice was quiet, steadier than I expected, given the state of her face. "I've asked myself that every day for 8 months, and I genuinely don't know." Oliver turned to look at her, and I saw in that turn, in the particular angle of his head, and the expression that moved across his face in the second before he managed to reassemble it into something more neutral, that he had understood something, not the details, not yet, but the shape of it, the general geography of what was happening in this room. "Vanessa," he said, just her name, quietly. She didn't look at him, she kept looking at me. "It started as a month," she said, "just 1 month. The consultancy had a payment due to a contractor, and the business account was completely dry, and I'd already borrowed what I could from our savings, and I couldn't tell Oliver, because I told him twice already that year that things were difficult, and I told him both times that I'd sorted it, that it was temporary, that the next quarter would be better." She stopped, drew a breath. And I believed that. I want you to know that. Every time I said it, I believed it. I know, I said. The second month I told myself it was still just borrowing, that I'd had a promising conversation with a new client, and if it came through I'd be able to replace both months at once, and no one would ever need to know. The client didn't come through, Richard said. Not harshly, just as a statement. No, she said. They didn't. Oliver had not moved. He was sitting very still beside her, looking at the table now, and his stillness was different from hers. It was the stillness of a man absorbing something painful in real time, the way you absorb a physical shock, needing a moment before the full extent of it becomes clear. I slid the folder across the table. I didn't open it. I just moved it toward them. Vanessa looked at it. Then she reached out and opened it herself. I watched her go through the first few pages, the transaction records, the timeline, her own account details, printed cleanly on Richard's office paper, the authorization form with the signature. She turned each page carefully, steadily, the way you move through something that you already know is there, but that becomes more real with each confirmation. When she reached the handwriting analyst's letter, she stopped. She read it through once. Then she closed the folder. I practiced it, she said. She wasn't looking at any of us now. She was looking at the middle distance, at something only she could see. Your signature. I'd seen it on forms before. You'd sign things at Oliver's. I practiced it for 2 weeks before I felt like I had it close enough. And even then, when I was actually writing it on the form, my hand was shaking so badly that I had to stop and start again. The room was absolutely quiet. I knew it was wrong, she said. I knew it the moment I posted the form. I knew it every single month when the transfer went through. And I kept thinking, next month I'll fix it. I'll find the client, or sell something, or find another way, and I'll replace it all and I'll confess to it properly, and it'll be over. And instead, she stopped. And instead it got worse, Oliver said. It was the first time he'd spoken more than a word, and the flatness in his voice, not anger exactly, but the sound of someone who has just had to revise their understanding of something fundamental, filled the room in a way that was harder to sit with, somehow, than anything else that had been said. Yes, Vanessa said. Instead, it got worse. Oliver looked at me then, and in his face I saw something that I want to be careful how I describe, because it matters, and I want to get it right. He wasn't angry with me. He wasn't relieved that it was in the open. He looked, and this is the word that came to me then, and has stayed with me since. He looked bereft. The specific grief of a person who has just been shown that the life they thought they were living had a room in it they didn't know existed. Dad, he said, I'm sorry. And I want to tell you something about that moment, because it was not the moment I had anticipated, and it moved me more than I expected it to. I hadn't brought them here to receive apologies. I hadn't sat in Grosvenor Park and on the bench by the river and in Richard's office for 2 months, working through the shape of this situation in order to collect the debt of someone's remorse. But when Oliver said those 2 words, quietly, simply, with no performance attached to them, I felt something give way in my chest that I hadn't fully known was braced. Because the worst part of all of this had never been the money. It had been the silence. The months and months of Sunday dinners and ordinary conversation, and carefully maintained surfaces, and underneath it all, a secret that had been eating its way through the foundations of everything. What hurt most was the idea that the people I loved most in my life had looked at a terrible difficulty and had not thought, not for a moment, that I might be the person to bring it to, that I might not be the one who would help, but the one who could be quietly used instead. I'm 74 years old. I've made my share of mistakes. I've had periods in my own life where the gap between what I was presenting and what was actually true was wider than it should have been. I know what it costs to tell someone something that diminishes you in your own eyes. I know the particular arithmetic of shame. the way it makes the cost of honesty seem higher than it actually is, and the cost of avoidance seem lower than it will eventually prove to be. But I'd always believed, I had genuinely believed, that if someone I loved was in serious trouble, they would come to me. Not because I'm exceptional, or because I'd always handled things perfectly, but simply because I'm their family. And family is supposed to be the place where the truth can land, without destroying everything. That was the thing that had been broken. And sitting there in the sitting room with the folder on the table and the river outside and all four of us quietly holding the weight of the last 2 months, I knew that fixing it, really fixing it, not the financial part but the thing underneath, was going to take considerably longer than any repayment schedule Richard might draw up. I looked at Vanessa. "I'm not going to pretend this didn't happen," I said. "And I'm not going to tell you that it's all right, because it isn't. What you did was wrong. It was wrong when you posted the authorization form, and it was wrong every month for 7 months after that. And the fact that the money went on keeping the business alive, rather than on anything personal, that matters. And it's part of why we're having this conversation instead of a different one. But it doesn't make it right." She nodded. She wasn't crying. She'd moved past crying into something quieter and more settled. "What I want," I continued, "is a proper resolution, not a punishment. A resolution, which means everything that was taken gets repaid, in a structured way, supervised by Richard, over a realistic timeline. It means full transparency from this point on, with me and with Oliver. And it means that what happened in this room today stays in this room. There are no other people who need to know." Oliver looked at me. "Dad," he started. "That's not generosity," I said. "I want to be clear about that. It's pragmatism. Dragging this into a public or legal arena doesn't get the money back any faster, and it costs all 3 of us far more than it's worth. But the agreement has to be real, documented, and kept." I looked at Richard. He opened his briefcase and placed a neatly typed document on the table. "I've prepared a repayment agreement," he said. £12,929, divided into monthly payments over 3 years, with a signed acknowledgement of the debt and a statement of the circumstances. It's not a legal judgment. It's a private agreement. But it's binding, and it's witnessed." Vanessa looked at the document for a long moment. Then she said something I didn't expect. "The consultancy," she said. "I think I need to close it." Oliver looked at her. "I've been trying to save something that can't be saved," she said. "I've known that for at least a year, maybe longer. I kept thinking that if I could just hold on long enough, something would turn around. But I was wrong, and continuing to run it, continuing to pretend it's a viable business when it isn't, that's just another version of the same thing I've been doing with all of this, holding a surface in place and hoping nobody looks underneath." She said it evenly, without self-pity, with the specific clarity of someone who has been through the worst part of a reckoning and come out the other side with something they didn't have before. Not peace, not yet, but honesty. A genuine, undecorated willingness to see things as they actually were. "That's your decision," I said. "I'm not asking you to do that." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm doing it." Richard went through the agreement carefully with all 3 of us. Oliver read every line twice, which is his nature, and which I've always respected. There were 2 small amendments Oliver suggested. He'd slipped, almost without noticing, into his professional mode, and I found that both touching and entirely characteristic, which Richard incorporated on the spot in neat handwriting, and then Vanessa signed it, and Oliver signed it as witness, and Richard signed it, and I signed it last, in the particular way I've always signed my name, with the W that has 3 peaks and the T and W that run slightly together. We sat with the signed document for a moment, and then Oliver stood up and went to the kitchen and came back with the whiskey I keep in the cupboard above the sink. I hadn't even told him it was there. He'd simply gone and found it the way sons find things in their father's kitchens. And he poured 4 small glasses without asking anyone if they wanted one. And we sat there in the quiet sitting room above the River Dee and we drank it. Nobody gave a toast. Nobody needed to. In the months that followed, Vanessa did exactly what she'd said she would do. She wound down the consultancy quietly and professionally, informed her remaining clients in good time, settled what debts she could, handled the whole process with a thoroughness that I suspected she'd always been capable of, and that the denial of the business's failure had been preventing her from applying. She found a position in facilities management at one of the historic commercial buildings near the city center. A significant step down in title and salary from what she'd been doing. She took it without complaint. The repayments began in January. Regular, punctual, without exception. Oliver and I spoke more that winter than we had in years. Not about any of this, most of the time. About ordinary things. The way fathers and sons, who are both somewhat reserved, sometimes find it easier to talk about the Railway Heritage Society's upcoming events, or what he'd been reading, or the particular pleasure of a good walk along the Dee, when the winter light hit the water at the right angle. But the conversations were different, fuller, like rooms that had been closed for a while and were now open again, and the air was moving through them. I won't pretend everything was repaired quickly or cleanly. That's not how these things work, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. Trust, once broken, doesn't reconstitute itself on a timeline. It comes back in installments, the way Vanessa's repayments came. Regular, unspectacular, building toward something complete through the accumulation of consistent actions, rather than through any single dramatic gesture. There was an afternoon in late spring that I want to tell you about, because it matters to how this story ends. I'd been invited to give a short talk at a community lecture series organized by a local heritage group. The subject was the history of railway infrastructure in Cheshire. Not a riveting topic for most people, I'm aware, but these things find their audience. The lecture was being held in a beautiful old commercial building near the center of Chester, one of those Victorian structures with high ceilings and marble floors, and a staircase that sweeps up from the entrance hall in a single elegant curve that you suspect was designed specifically to make people feel that arriving somewhere matters. I arrived about 40 minutes early, the way I always do, to get a sense of the space before it fills with people. The entrance hall was quiet. The morning light was coming through the high windows in long, pale panels, and lying across the marble floor in a way that made the whole space feel like something out of a painting. And there, on the staircase, moving a soft cloth along the marble balustrade with careful, methodical strokes, was Vanessa. She had her back to the door when I came in. She heard the door and turned around. For a fraction of a second, neither of us moved. Then she straightened, tucked the cloth under her arm, and said, clearly and without any awkwardness that I could detect, "Good morning, sir. The lecture room's on the first floor. I'll have it unlocked for you in just a moment." And what I want to tell you about that moment, what I want you to understand, because I think it's the heart of everything I've been trying to say, is what I heard in her voice. I'd been prepared, if I'm honest, to hear humiliation, the particular painful note of someone who has been reduced to a situation they never imagined, and who hasn't yet made their peace with it. I thought about that possibility on the walk over, and I thought about how I would respond to it, and what the right thing to say might be. But there was no humiliation. What I heard was humility. And those two things, I want to be very precise about this distinction, because it matters enormously. Those two things are completely different. Humiliation is something done to you. It's imposed from outside. It's about power. It leaves damage. Humility is something you arrive at. It's interior. It's earned. It's about seeing yourself accurately without flinching. One diminishes a person. The other, in a strange and counterintuitive way, enlarges them. Vanessa, standing on that staircase with a polishing cloth under her arm in a building she helped to maintain, was not a diminished person. She was someone who had made a serious mistake and had faced it completely, and had chosen the long and unglamorous road of becoming someone different, not through declarations or promises or the drama of public remorse, through turning up every day and doing the work honestly and letting time and consistency say the thing that words couldn't. I walked to the foot of the staircase. "Vanessa," I said, "the building looks beautiful." She looked at me for a moment, and then she smiled, not the carefully assembled smile I remembered from the dinner table, not the smooth social instrument, a real one, small and unperformed and entirely genuine. "Thank you, Thomas," she said, and that was all. I gave my lecture. The room was about half full, mostly retired people, a few enthusiasts, a couple of university students who'd presumably wandered in by accident and stayed out of politeness. I talked about the Chester and Holyhead line and about Stevenson and about the particular engineering decisions that went into the original D Bridge. I enjoyed it. I always enjoy talking about the railways to anyone willing to listen. Afterward, walking home along the groves in the spring evening with the D catching the last of the light and the willows beginning to put their leaves back on after the winter, I thought about the whole arc of it, all of it, from that Tuesday morning in the kitchen with the number on the screen to this evening, this walk, this river. Nearly 13,000 pounds, 7 months, a forged signature, a business that couldn't be saved, a marriage that had developed a room neither person was entering, a Sunday afternoon in a flat above the D with a closed folder on the table, and 4 cups of tea, and one question that had been waiting months to be asked. And what had come out of it? Not a clean ending. I want to be honest about that. Life doesn't do clean endings, not in my experience. What came out of it was something messier and more real, and ultimately more valuable than any clean ending could have been. What came out of it was truth. Actual truth, not the managed version of it. The real thing.